try and visualize quantum mechanics, you'll end up with a headache. We simply have no way of really getting our heads around the deep mysteries in quantum mechanics from the point of view of actually visualizing it. Well, maybe one day in quantum mechanics we will have more of an understanding in such a way that we will be able to get our heads around it, but that doesn't seem to be likely very soon. But maybe that will be the same, with the theological package as well, that maybe there are just some missing elements, and once those are known to us, perhaps not in this life, but in the age to come, it'll make perfect sense. Just a few missing bits of data. This is where my story from getting lost, that, of course, I had read my map instructions today as having to turn off the 401 West at exit 427. Yeah, it's not exit 427, it's highway 427. Okay, so a little bit of missing data can be very important. So there was I merrily and completely, relaxed, sort of heading. I thought it was a bit of a long way, actually. Where is this exit 427? And then suddenly exit 427 wasn't there, and we got to exit 431, and then I knew something was badly wrong. Okay, so, but one little bit of missing data can completely change your whole perspective of life, and so forth. So, and I think that's maybe the way it is in some of our theological conundrums as well. We do know how precious we are to God. You came from the Lord Adam, and the lady Eve, said Aslan, and that is both honor enough to erect the head of the poorest beggar. Maybe just close with a meditation from Diogenes Allen, who's, I think was at Princeton Theological Seminary. Through Christ, he said, it is possible to understand how the Father's love is present in all things, even in suffering. Suffering can be regarded as a mark of our distance from God because we are subject to the cosmos simply by being creatures. Yet depending on a person's response to suffering, a person can be in contact with God through their suffering and in suffering. To be in touch with the reality God has made, even when it is a painful touch, is to have indirect contact with Him who is above it and who is above all else love. Insofar as it is contact, it is good. Insofar as it is painful, it is not. But what a difference when the same pain results in the grip of a friend and not the mindless grip of nature. I think that's quite, it takes, I'll leave it up, it takes a little chewing over and thinking about what I think is a rather fine kind of commentary about this rather ambiguous situation in which we find ourselves as believers, trusting in that loving God, and yet, of course, so often having to face this very deep problem of suffering. Okay, so I'm going to finish there, and gone slightly over half an hour, sorry about that, but I do want to leave some time for questions and discussion. I know I just zipped through a whole lot of material. Thank you. Yeah, just to repeat that question, the question really is about the Arrhenius' understanding of the fall as more a process, and the possibility that this relates more easily to the evolutionary narrative as being, as it were, well, of course, Arrhenius, I guess, has the concept of humans being born like children, doesn't he, and almost childlike, and therefore it's really not their fault, because we don't blame children, for going astray, and there's all that idea, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, in Irenaeus. So, no, I think it's a very good question. I think, and of course, John Hick is quite keen on the Irenaean view in his book on suffering, a sort of classic book on suffering and so forth. I have a bit of a problem with that. So I think the problem with, if you take a very Irenaean view of the fall, and that it sort of is due to the weakness of humankind, really, and we're like children and going astray and all that kind of idea, then, of course, where it takes you off is where a lot of theologians are going, actually, which is to try and say, well, actually, the evolutionary narrative is about the fall. It's about how, how people, as they became more morally aware, actually didn't live together harmoniously, and they sort of had all these social problems which came about also through farming and, through their cultural practices, and it becomes actually more a sociobiological account, actually, almost. And I've seen some theologians trying to translate it into a kind of sociobiology account, okay. To my mind anyway, that misses certain really key elements, in the Genesis text, which does suggest, that there you have people with fellowship with God, who knew God, who walked with God in the cool of the day, this sort of lovely phrase. And so, and and something deeply, profoundly went wrong. You know, they did rebel against that knowledge of God they'd been given. So what I'm trying to do, I suppose, is to take away the narrative of the fall from evolutionary biology at all. So I'm saying it has that. If you take Model C, which is the model I guess I do favour, then it would say, really the fall has nothing to do with evolutionary biology at all. Okay? So, but obviously you need all of that evolutionary account to deliver humankind who can have the right equipment to be able to talk to God, who has language, who has culture, seeking after God, and so forth. All of that is part of the evolutionary package, if you like. But that's, as I say, necessary but not sufficient to know God and to respond to his commands and to responsibilities received from God. So that's why I steer away from that sociobiological interpretation, if you like, because I think that misses out a whole lot of important theology, and steer towards more of the Genesis text in that way. I think it's important to preserve that. That would be my own view. The question really, it's a two-sided question, and they're two sides of the same coin, I think. And the question is, why, on one side, is there this great Christian sort of reaction against evolution in some circles? And then the other part of the question is, why do scientists and biologists have a hard time in taking on board a kind of narrative of creation as well as the scientific data that they look at every day? I do think those are, you know, I think they're related closely together. And I think the first part very much is that, what I see anyway, is that very often Darwin has been encrusted with all these barnacles of ideology. Okay, so, and actually we were talking about this in the Pascal lectures in the past couple of days. Historically, all the ways in which Darwinism and evolution has been used to support all kinds of ideologies. I mean, almost every ideology you can think of: capitalism, socialism, Marxism, you know, racism, feminism, everything. You know, I mean, evolution has been wheeled on to try and support that particular ideology. So I don't blame people out in the public domain at all if they don't really think about science when when they hear the word Darwinism or hear the word evolution, they think about one of these ideologies, you know, and almost that package is what comes to their minds first. So I think that possibly helps to explain the aversion, you know, that you find out in the Christian community. I'm sure there are other reasons as well. I mean, young Earth creationism is really a 20th century movement, and it's a fascinating history about how it became popular. And Ron Numbers, the historian, has a fat book, 600 pages, of how creationism came to America. And his account really it's a 20th century account. It actually started with his own denomination, you know, the Seventh-day Adventists in the 1920s and so forth. But it's a fascinating history. But I think, and that history does support that idea, you know, a lot of the response, I mean, the First World War, the reaction against evolution was coming out of the German expansionism and the whole idea of the Kaiser's officers that might is right, and, you know, that the struggle for existence justified a lot of what they were doing and so forth. So there's a whole interesting story there. On the other side, I think of course, the problem with, I think, the young Earth creationists, they have a very kind of engineering view, if I can put it that way, about what creation is about. I mean, to my mind, biblical creation is about the great dualism between God and everything else that exists. You know, God speaks and things come into being. And so everything that exists is upheld, it's sustained, it's dependent upon God's will. Okay, so, and what we as scientists do is simply to describe what God does. That's all we can do. There is nothing else to describe. Okay, so even if scientists don't know they're doing that, that's what they're actually doing. Okay, every day in their labs. So of course the problem is that scientists very often hear about the concept of creation through the young Earth creationist movement, because it gets publicity in the media and it gets into Nature and it gets into Science and lots of huffing and puffing, you know, and all that kind of thing. And so of course that's their view that they have. They don't understand that what Christians mean by creation is an author who writes the whole book, who actually sustains everything that exists. He's not like the engineer occasionally doing magic trick. Not a magic trick. Engineers don't do magic tricks, but you know what I mean. Sort of occasionally, let's make up the genetic code, let's make up a flagellum today, you know, that kind of thing. I mean, you just don't find that understanding of God, I don't think, in the scriptures. This sort of engineering God, the God of the intelligent design movement, or the designer of that movement. So I think trying to theologically educate scientists, actually, is a good first step. And of course, to do that, you have to be there. in the lab or at coffee time, or get them to come to Faraday courses, which is why we design a lot of our Faraday courses specifically with scientists in mind, so they're weekend courses, they leave the lab